And welcome one and all to the final standard lecture of the series. There's still another month left to go until the end of the term, of course, but at this point, it's all going to be about review and revision. You're going to go over what you've learned and consolidate it as you work on the research paper and the final exam. But in terms of cramming new information into your heads, we've reached the end of the line. And that's why for our final work that we're going to study, I've tried to pick something that can really give us a sense of the journey we've gone on in this course. I wanted you to see how far we've come since our very first work, since the Palestrina Kyria. And even though the work of art we're studying here was probably written and performed considerably earlier, I like the fact that it was published in the year 1700. Now, the composer of our music, Arcangelo Corelli, he was already 47 years old in 1700. He'd been a famous violinist for decades, and the idea behind this volume, when it gets published, is so people have access to music he's been performing for a long time. Now, this particular composition, the one we're going to be studying here, is called Sonata No. 6 for violin and cello or harpsichord. And maybe the first thing you should know before anything else is that it's not really one piece of music. This sonata is broken into several parts or movements, and each one of these is completely different. It's its own separate musical unit. So this is really more like an album than a single song. There are actually 5 short movements, and they're stretched out over the course of 11 minutes. Those are actually Italian words relating to the speed of the music. So you see there's number 1, grave, and number 4, adagio. Those both mean that the music moves fairly slowly. And then movements 2, 3, and 5, those are all labeled allegro, which means cheerful, and it's saying that the music moves at a very fast, you might say cheerful pace. And so moving on to the title itself, the least interesting word here is sonata. This is an Italian word that basically just means music making. This sonata is written, and I quote here, for violin and cello or harpsichord. And I'll come back to that cello or harpsichord part later. But the really important thing here, the thing that you want to fix in your mind, is that first instrument mentioned, the violin. In many ways, the story of this music that we'll be studying, it's the story of that starring instrument. If you understand what the violin is doing here, you'll understand a lot. I was saying a moment ago that Corelli was a violin player, first and foremost. He was only known for writing music because of all the things that he wrote to perform for himself on his chosen instrument. He'd perform in concertos, which are these large concert pieces, and he'd also perform in these sonatas, where you would just have a single instrument, such as a cello or a harpsichord, to provide accompaniment for the violin. But it was always Corelli and his violin. That's what people came to hear. And the interesting thing about this period, the thing about, let's say, the mid to late 17th century, is that this is the era when the violin becomes the ultimate musical instrument. And when I say violin here, I primarily mean the instrument that Corelli played, which is small, very high-pitched. But I'm also referring to some extent to the other instruments that are part of this family. Because in addition to the violin, you have the viola, the cello, and the double bass. And the only real difference between all of these is their size. The 3 larger instruments are just violins that can hit deeper notes because they're bigger. And these instruments, let's call them the violin family. The violin family had been around for a while. They had existed in a form that we would recognize for over a century before Corelli was even born. But for a long time, they were overshadowed by another family of closely related instruments, which many performers and many composers preferred. For over a century, until just before Corelli was born, the violin and the other instruments in its family often took second place to a family of related instruments called viols. When I say that viols are a family, I just mean that as with the violin, there's not just one instrument. There are bigger ones and smaller ones that can play at different pitches. So you can write a piece of music just for viols and have them covering the high, middle, and low parts. And there's a reason that the name viol sounds so similar to violin. That's a product of the fact that these are fairly similar instruments with a very similar history. They both developed from the stringed and bowed instruments that would have been played during the Middle Ages. It's true that you can find relatively small differences in the design. So viols have 6 strings, where violins have only 4. And while you can play even a small viol on your lap or between your legs, the violin and the slightly larger viola both have to be played in the crook of your neck. But practically speaking, there are only 2 differences really worth mentioning. The first difference explains why viols were more popular than violins for a very long time. And the second difference, that one explains why this all changed in Corelli's time, with violins ending up on top. Now, the main reason that viols were more popular at first is probably just that they're easier to play. If you're someone who enjoys music but you don't have time to do it professionally, a viol is your best bet. The tone is darker and smoother, and it sounds good even if you're an amateur. A violin, by contrast, can be harsh and squeaky unless you really know what you're doing. But the secret here is that even though the violin can be a very difficult instrument, it's a much better fit for the kind of music that increasingly is being written in Corelli's time. Because viols have such a dark, smooth sound, they blend really well. And they're best in music where you want all the parts to blend together. And that's why around the year 1600, you'll see so many fantasias written for viols. Because if you remember, a fantasia, such as Praetorius's Ein feste Burg, a fantasia is a piece based on imitative texture. And so if you want to write something that sounds like an instrumental version of Palestrina's Kyrie, that's your best bet. But of course, different composers have different needs, and the distinctive sound of the viol family may not be for everyone. What if you don't want to sound like Palestrina? What if you don't want all the parts to blend into a single texture so it's like they're one big instrument? In that case, the bright, clear tone of the violin is best. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. The violin becomes popular in Corelli's time simply because it suits the kind of music that people want to write. Composers start to value the sharpness of the violin because of the way that it can stand out. And of course, you already know why this is happening. You already know why people were looking for a sound that can stand out, because you've heard about this in the context of vocal music. When I talked about Monteverdi and the Madrigal, I told you how Monteverdi radically simplified the texture of his music. He moved away from that complicated imitative texture which you still have with Gesualdo, and he tried to put all the emphasis on a single vocal line. Monteverdi's writing music that calls for a singer with a bright, high, clear voice, the kind of sound that can cut through the clutter and hold the listener's attention. And of course, I also mentioned to you in my lecture on Lully's Lacrimosa that this becomes the model for more and more church music as well. It starts with opera, but then it bleeds into sacred music too. Now, imitative textures, they don't go away completely. And a lot of Corelli's music actually still sounds like what used to be called a fantasia. But there's a lot more interest in what's called monody. There's more interest in a texture where all the parts are moving together to support this one essential melodic line. And so all that's happened with Corelli is that this revolution has finally reached instrumental music. Corelli's sonatas take an approach that is already the standard with madrigals, with opera, even church music, wherever someone is singing, and he applies it to music where there's no singing. And the violin is the natural instrument for this, because of that same bright tone which can be sharp and grating if you haven't taken the time to really master it. The violin has the potential to take the place of the star singer in a Monteverdi madrigal. It can function like someone with a high, clear, bright voice that can really hold your attention. The only difference, of course, is that a violin can do things that a singer simply can't. For one thing, it has a wider range than pretty much any human voice. So a violin can hit higher notes than any soprano, which is the highest female voice, but it can also go lower. And while skill obviously matters a lot here, a violin is potentially much more agile than a human voice. So Corelli can write parts that run and jump and leap in a way that Monteverdi or Lully would hesitate to do, just because it would be almost impossible to sing. But perhaps most important here, violins can do something that doesn't come naturally to the human voice, which is to produce two different notes at the same time. It's a little bit tricky, but if you scrape more than one string with your bow, you can get double or triple or even quadruple notes out of a violin. And Corelli, he does this a lot. When he wants to, he can make it feel that there are several violins playing instead of just one. He can create a rich, dense, challenging sound that would be impossible with just a voice. And of course, the violin can't speak, it can't actually recite a text the way a human voice can. But what really matters here, and we'd be tempted to say this has been true of a lot of Monteverdi and Lilly's music too, what really matters is the music. And in the end, that's the best way to think of a Corelli violin sonata. Each one of the parts, the movements, remember there are 5 movements in the violin sonata you'll be hearing. Each one of these is like a madrigal or a song from an opera. But instead of having a human voice, all the singing is done by the violin. And this way of thinking isn't just helpful in terms of understanding the violin part, it can also explain that other instrument mentioned in the title, the cello or harpsichord that's supposed to play with the violin. The key here is that because this is essentially monodic music, only the one part matters, the main part, the violin, which takes the part of the singer. And so everything else is going to have a supporting role. And Corelli says that the second instrument in the sonata, it could be a cello, it could be a harpsichord. He doesn't specify because he doesn't really care. It could probably be both. Sometimes that's how it's been performed. Or it could be another instrument like a guitar or a small organ. All of that would probably be fine because the supporting instrument just doesn't matter too much. When you listen to this music, your attention is supposed to be focused on the bright, piercing voice of the violin. And everything else, that's just wallpaper. It's not quite as extreme here as Lamento della Ninfa, of course. You'll remember in that piece that Monteverdi has the poor player of the bass instrument, whatever that may be. They have to play the same 4 notes for several minutes. And Corelli's bass part isn't that simple, but it's close. And you can really see how much Corelli has assimilated Monteverdi's basic method if you look at the way he writes out the so-called cello or harpsichord part. Or maybe you could say it's how he doesn't write out the part. If you look at the bass part for Corelli's violin sonata, you'll see he doesn't just let you decide what instrument you'll use. He's also comfortable letting you basically make up the exact notes you're going to play. He writes out the very lowest note and he leaves it up to the performer to improvise the rest. And this is the opposite of the carefully constructed imitative texture that you would see with Palestrina or in those fantasias for viols I was mentioning. In a piece like that, every note has to fit just right, or the whole thing falls apart into clanging noise. But Corelli's not trying to do this. He's not trying to build this elaborate musical crossword puzzle with different lines weaving in and out, so he doesn't care about the details of what the bass is doing. And that can actually be liberating for the bass player. Because their part isn't expected to share melodies with the violin, they have room to improvise. It's a bit like jazz music early in the 20th century, where improvisation was just expected. The only other thing that Corelli cares about with the bass part, and this is revealing too, the only other thing he cares about is that the bass player produces the right harmony. That's what those little numbers are above the notes, the 3, 4, 5, 6s. Those numbers are a code to let the bass player know what kind of harmony they need to make as they improvise. This is called figured bass, and it's standard for instrumental bass parts by the end of the 17th century. Professional musicians are trained to recognize the harmonies that these numbers represent. And I emphasize this because it's one more way that Corelli has taken over the style that you see in Monteverdi's Madrigals and in Lully's church music. He's not concerned about the way that a melody unfolds over several measures, but he's very concerned about the harmony, the combination of sounds at any given point in the music. And while no one uses the term yet, these are clear examples of what becomes known as chords. In a chord, you have several notes, usually 3 or 4, and they work together to create a unit. And so it isn't note, 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 as it would have been with Palestrina or even Gesualdo, but chord, chord, chord. Even when Corelli writes imitative music, and he does this sometimes, even then you can see that he's still thinking in terms of chords. He's thinking about one combination of notes leading into another the way that Palestrina never would. And so in that sense, even Corelli's imitative music is very close to monody. It's still moving down a single path, which is what monody means. And there's one reason in particular that this is important to the story we're telling in this class. What matters here is not just that Corelli is building on the techniques of Monteverdi and Lully, although of course he is. We're also seeing a step forward in the process of music and of art in general becoming important for its own sake. When we started this course with Palestrina, the music was definitely secondary. It was there to serve the needs of the sacred ritual of the Mass. And that was what it was like with a lot of earlier art. It, as you saw during these lectures, that started to change with the Madrigal. With the Madrigal, the music not only enhanced the feeling of the poem, but you could also just enjoy it as music. And now we reach the point, as we get to Corelli's concertos and sonatas, that the music is all there is. These are madrigals without words, songs without words. And so the music stands on its own apart from any lyrics, religious or otherwise. The music has to stand on its own because it's the only thing you're there to hear. And this is a perfect example of what I mean by the secular sphere. The music is taken so seriously that it's still almost like a form of religious observance for someone whose religion is art and beauty. It's almost like attending a church service when you come to hear it. It's a church that celebrates human creativity rather than God's mercy and justice. And as I've said before, it's not that religion has gone away by the end of the 17th century. Religion is still essential to so many people's lives, then just as it is today. But at the same time, a part of life has opened up where your religious affiliation simply doesn't matter. Art can now exist outside of religion, independent of it. And while we've certainly seen this before in this course, it's never been so clear as with this Corelli violin sonata. and that's why I thought that this would be the perfect place to conclude the course. I'm so grateful to all of you that you've been able to come with me on this journey. And I want to thank you all for your attention in listening to these lectures and for your hard work in writing the short responses. And speaking of that, we have one more short response left to discuss.